questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Shellenberger, in your testimony, you highlight that significantly expanding variable renewables requires significantly expanding the size and complexity of the grid to make up for both variable energy supply and low power density. You also note that the National Academies of Sciences has clearly and repeatedly said that complexity will make electricity grids less resilient, all else being equal, than simpler grids. How can we maintain grid resiliency while also building a diverse energy supply?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I think the first obvious thing is that we need a diversity of supply. I think it would be very risky and radical to depend entirely on natural gas and variable renewable energy sources. The final comment I made was that at their lowest, wind was 2% of Texas's electricity grid. Not all energy sources are the same. The fact that there was some failures among power plants is not the same as the essential weather dependence of some energy sources. And I interviewed the authors of the 3 National Academies of Sciences reports. They stressed emphatically that complexity reduces resiliency, adding microgrids reduces resiliency, that these things have consequences. The more complex the grid, the more people are involved, the higher the costs. I just will also mention this idea that there is some inevitability to a transition towards variable renewable energy sources is incorrect. It is not shared by most energy experts. It is a consequence of policy choices. And if we want to have affordable, reliable, resilient electricity sources, we need reliable sources of electricity produced in large, efficient power plants, whether nuclear, natural gas, or coal. And if we want sustainability, I think it's clear too that you need to have nuclear, because every time we shut down a nuclear plant, it's replaced by natural gas, carbon emissions go up, prices go up. This has been proven now in California, it's been proven around the world, and now we have many nuclear plants across the United States that are at risk of shutting down prematurely and being replaced by natural gas, which would reduce resiliency and reliability, reduce affordability. And in fact, I think this push to just continue to expand variable renewable energy sources would accelerate the premature and unnecessary closure of those power plants.
All right, I appreciate that. Madam Chair, I would like to insert into the record at the end of the hearing a chart on renewable generation in Texas from March 2021 from the Texas Synchrophaser Network, created by Professor Matt Grady and Dr. Andrew Mattei, if I spelled that correct, at Baylor University. This chart shows how renewables in ERCOT can swing from 10 to 60% of the total electricity generation. This huge variation exemplifies the challenge of integrating renewables onto the grid. One of the major issues that contributed in both California and Texas, blackouts. Given, Dr. Shellenberger, or Mr. Shellenberger, given that more states are continuing to increase the percentage of renewable energy sources in their power grid systems, can you discuss the predictably unreliable properties of some renewables, especially during extreme weather?
Well, sure. I mean, we saw in the power outage in California last summer, part of the reason it was such high demand for electricity was because it was so hot and demand for air conditioning was so high. Those were the same conditions that meant the wind was not blowing. So we did not have wind energy resources available during that heat wave. And that means that more transmission lines to more wind farms would not have made any difference whatsoever. Similar story in Texas. You have to look at the lowest output levels, because that's the levels at which you are ultimately dependent on to avoid the cascading failures that everybody fears. So we saw in Texas, it reached 2% of its capacity, whereas nuclear only went down to 73%. And the only reason we lost one of those reactors is because they had a sensor that was unnecessarily triggered by cold water and could actually be prevented in the future. Whereas the weather-dependent nature of wind, meaning it only produces electricity when the wind is blowing, is not fixable. You can weatherize the turbines, but they still depend on the wind energy.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I read your book over the weekend. I was doing it on audio. I loved it so much. I bought the hardback, and I appreciate you being here to testify today. And look forward to chatting with you in the future. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you,
I
sir.
thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Chairman